Welcome to East Coast DNA. I'm sure most people tuning in today are aware of who my guest is. We have the infamous Joel Plaskett. So
Infamous. All right.
definitely in the East Coast region, everybody knows who Joel Plaskett is. So if any of our East Coast viewers are watching, you definitely know Joel. I am curious, Joel. I know of you from way back with like Thrush Hermit.
Yep.
And like obviously people that have followed your career would be very aware of the influence that you've had on East Coast music over the last 3 decades, which is kind of painful to say because I remember you from back then.
No, I'm 49 now, so I've been in it since I was a teenager. So yeah.
Yeah. So I'm curious with that kind of a viewpoint. A lot of the guests that we have on are like up and coming or perhaps new to the region. Few
Yep.
times I get people from other regions that are coming on tour down this way. But with yourself, where you've always been rooted in Nova Scotia and like you're kind of synonymous with East Coast music in my circles anyway. How has the region influenced you as a musician?
Well, I grew up down in Lunenburg till I was 12. I was there from the age of 4 to 12, and my dad was one of the folks who helped sort of start the Lunenburg Folk Festival. So I grew up around music kind of socially, and my dad was playing socially with some guys in a band called Starboard Side, and he played the folk festival. So I was always around music growing up. And although I didn't want to play it till I was a teenager, it was when we moved to Halifax when I met I didn't know anybody, and I was introduced to a guy named Rob Benvey and his friend Ian McGettigan, and we went on to form Thrush Hermit together. But Rob started playing guitar, and I was like, "Oh, Dad, teach me guitar." So I got something I can do with these guys that I just met. Basically, I was into music. I'd always enjoyed
Hmm.
it, but so the this is all just to say that the kind of culture on the East Coast that I've noticed is music's very, I mean, I think this is the case everywhere to some degree, but I think it's strong on the East Coast is that it's woven into the social fabric. Like music's not super precious. It's sort of present and important, but it's not there's often just somebody in the corner singing songs in the pub and everyone's talking over it, but talking over them. But at the same time, people wouldn't feel the same if there was nobody there playing music.
Yeah.
There's the idea that there's that music is of sort of value and part of the weave. Um, and so in that way, I think I've taken that into the way that I like to perform, which is like I take it seriously. I like to be listened to. I don't love to be talked over, to be honest. I don't know how well I do in the corner of that said pub or whatever. But that being said, I am used to kind of like having to sort of try to swing to reach the back of the room. That's how we kind of came up playing. Because Halifax was always a neat town for music, continues to be so with the university scene of people going out, but then the kind of Navy history, the tourism that kind of comes and goes, as well as the art college, which is sort of like informs, people wanting to sort of do stuff that's, you know, for the art. And sometimes
Yeah.
sort of like, that's not cool, but this is, kind of. So that sort of mix has always been interesting to me because it's made for sort of, I think, people who take both the art seriously, but the performance element is kind of there because there's been a lot of venues, but it's tougher right now as the
Mhm.
economics of the place get more expensive and more sort of development and money come to town. The places for people to kind of make music are getting a little more challenging. But yeah, I've always found the East Coast to be like a great casual but rooted place to make music. So there's kind of a long answer to your short question, sort of.
Well, and that kind of covers a follow-up that I had too, is that with a lot of artists, once they get to a certain success level, or if your career gets to a point where it's kind of repetitive, a lot of people want to move to a new region.
Mhm.
And especially with your level of success, like you have gotten to the point where you're popular enough that you absolutely could have packed a bag and moved to Toronto or went out to Vancouver or something like to be in a different music scene,
Yeah.
but you always stuck true to East Coast and you've been here. So,
And that was for a couple of reasons, I would say. One is that I'm a sort of a small city person by nature. So I'm not really desired to live in large cities. I like visiting them. I've gotten to visit them and perform in them and travel a lot from a young age. We toured right out of high school. So there's just a sort of just scale that I like
Hmm.
about Halifax. Um, there was the fact that I dug in here, uh, like my wife Rebecca. We met in the '90s, and she moved out here, and we had a sort of an apartment together, and we sort of found a house in Dartmouth in early 2000s and moved over to Dartmouth because it was sort of affordable at the time. And we sort of dug in there. And then I was able to find studio space here and have space to do stuff. So I don't think I would have found that elsewhere. The other thing that I found too is, oh, I mean, I had a lot of friends leave. I sort of always joke there's like a little Halifax in Toronto that you can go visit little Halifax, you know? Um, but and I get why people left. But sort of one thing happened for me is when I didn't decide to stay, but just by the nature of the fact that I stayed in that sort of late '90s, early 2000s, when a lot of people were leaving the Maritimes for work because the economics of the place were tough. When I started touring nationally with the emergency, when we go across and we play Calgary, Edmonton, a sea of Maritimers would show up, right? And it would be like, you're from back home. And there was this sort of like celebrated for having stayed.
Yeah, yeah,
It sort of actually flipped the switch, which was the sort of identity piece of it. Kind of I started to be associated with the region more at that time, partly because I was singing about that. You know, I also
hmm,
I sort of wrote this into my lyrics a little bit, you know, love this town and work out fine. Songs like that of mine kind of reference people leaving because there was a lot of that happening and this and that. So, you know, I'm conscious of it and it probably played into it a little bit. But as a result, it kind of meant the association with the place got stronger, and the community's always been really receptive to what I do here. So, and I travel enough to feel like um, doing other things. So yeah, I mean, I do love this part of the world, but I love seeing elsewhere, and I do find like there's a lot of neat scenes. But Halifax and Nova Scotia in general has a really special.
and you mentioned settling down in Dartmouth, so we have on previous episode talked about some of your business in Dartmouth there. So there's the
Yeah.
building with Morley's
Yep.
Coffee, Taz, and then Fang Recording.
Yeah, exactly. So in the back of the building, we've got the studio. I'm sitting in it right now, and Thomas Stager runs this place. He's good, great engineer and great songwriter as well. He's a performer sometimes too, but he's been um he's been running this place for better part of God, we're like 12 years. It's kind of
Yeah,
amazing. Like it's weird when you start to think of the passage of time. So we're pretty dug in here, and then the coffee shop opened back in 2016 or something like that. Taz in there. And more recently in 2021, we also added the bookstore, Friction Books, in there. So it's Morley's, Taz, and Friction. And so it's part of this, it's at 45 Portland Street in downtown Dartmouth. And there's a great community of people working here and being, it's quite a creative space, actually, you know, as far as just music, lots of musicians around working as part of it. And yeah, I feel really lucky to be part of that and to have, you know, and to have helped facilitate it just through the kind of, I don't know, I wanted a studio space, having worked in a bunch. And I've worked in a lot of great spaces and in different ways, but I always felt like I knew that I wanted a space that kind of functioned in the way that I like to record.
yeah.
Um, so when we got access to this space, it was just like, okay, I dug in and sort of built it on kind of a semi-commercial model so that it could it wouldn't just be a private studio. Like I wanted to do something that other people could use. So I do production work here as well as people rent the space. And yeah, it's been great.
And like I had mentioned, we have had guests on that have spoken highly of it. I
Nice.
know Andrew Shaver was just on a couple months ago and
Yeah.
painted a very romantic picture of that whole area and being
Oh,
able
great.
to
Great.
the community that's kind of incorporated into that too. But I'm curious where you have all of that with your new album.
Mhm.
So it's One Real Reveal.
Yeah.
Now, when I was reading about it and I listened to a preview of the album, which I'm a fan, but
Cool.
I'm
Right.
curious what made you go record differently because you
The
use
opposite
four
way.
track.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Basically having all this, like having a 32 channel desk and all these tape machines and everything. And we made the record. I made the record with the help of Thomas, as well as I did a little bit of it out west at Leroy Stagger's place. I have this cassette 4-track machine that I've been hauling around with me basically. It's like an old Tascam 244. It's a machine that I borrowed the same model off of Charles Austin, who runs another recording studio in town. Him and Frank have the Ocean Floor place. Charles was in the Super Friends, and I've known Charles a long time. He's like a an old friend. When I was 17, I borrowed Charles's 4-track and started demoing songs back in the Hermit days. I've always been fond of those machines. I know how to use them. They've got a pretty good EQ, and you can just record 4 tracks. And so I've got one machine, and I got another machine that sort of runs a little, not quite as well, but I got it for parts just in case this one breaks, you know.
Hmm.
And so I I I made the record on that using just a single microphone. I got a we got a really nice mic at the studio maybe a year and a half ago, an old pencil condenser from the 60s. That's a really smooth and unique sounding mic. It's called a KM56. It's beautiful. Just a small little pencil condenser. And I realized when I just sat that in front of me with the cassette machine and I flipped that mic into what's called Omni. When you're recording on some of the mics have different switches. So you got cardioid, the one that just picks up the front,
Hmm.
figure eight, which picks up both sides of the capsule, and Omni, which picks up the whole capsule. And this mic has those 3 settings. And in Omni, I was sitting and playing in front of it, the proximity effect of like moving in and out of the mic sort of disappears because when you got cardioid and you move in, it gets bassier. When you got Omni, you got a little room to move, and you can almost hear, even though it's a mono signal, you can almost hear the space changing because it's capturing the room and the way your voice reflects in the room. And so when I'd sing a song, I'd just do a single performance of the song, and I wouldn't be having to be totally still. I could kind of just weave a little bit, and then I'd overdub the harmonies with another instrument. I'd play another instrument and sing the harmony or do some vocal doubling. And I only had 4 tracks to play with, and that became the record. When we mixed those together, I just felt like the thing sounded really close, but
Hmm.
also sounded like a space and sounded really real. Even though it had overdubs, there's multiple versions of me singing along. There was something about the presence of it that I found really unique. And so when I did one track, the song High Summer, the second song on the album was the first one I kind of sat down. I just gotten back from England. I wrote that tune. I was like, oh, I'll just demo it on the 4-track. And I set up the 56 and I went, oh, I really like this sound. Um, and I just thought, oh, this is how I want to record. And so I just sort of made that the template for the whole record. And that limitation framed it in a way that I like to work within a frame, like some kind of
Yeah.
limitation. It's a really wide frame, like 44. My previous records, like 4 sprawling records, but they're kind of held together through this concept. So even that, as sprawling as it was, had these sort of limitations placed around it. 4 11 song records. That's what I want to do. 44, you know? So like once I get that idea, then I kind of work that way. So One Real Reveal came together with the limitation of that 4-track.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
I love the idea of having a concept to build around so that you have a framework that you're filling in with your content. Like
I,
it.
I mean, when I'm producing other people's records, I often try to sort of encourage that or go, what's the feeling we want? What's the limitation? What's the musical wall, or what's the
Mhm.
or the artistic wall that we're not going to cross? You know, we'll
Yeah,
get
yeah.
right up against it, but we won't cross it. You know, um, so yeah, I do like that, and what it does is it just makes me feel more creative within a certain space. And I go, okay, I'm not going to do that right now. And often I'll have other records in the background and other songs. There was other songs that I was considering for One Real Reveal. There's a couple other songs I recorded that didn't make the cut. I thought, oh well, it's just not this album. It'll show up somewhere else. You know, didn't work with the format or just didn't fit in the running order. In fact, there was a more up tempo song I struck from the record because the record ended up being so mellow and so
Mhm.
kind of co contemplative, I guess, for lack of a better word, um, that I felt like the one where I was singing out and it had more tempo, just felt like it sort of stuck out, like it pushed
Yeah.
the pushed the energy up to a place where I was like, this isn't the energy of that record. When I described the album, I was when I mentioned it to my wife and I said, "Oh, I think it's kind of like a late night record." She goes, "No." And then when she listened to it, she goes, "No, I think it's a morning before the sun comes up record." And I was like, "Oh, I like that more." And it actually, I do think she's right because I find if at night the record almost can put you to sleep.
Yeah.
It's really chill, you know? And but in that window right before or as the sun's coming up, it's got that solitary space. And I think it does kind of work in that frame a little bit. So yeah,
I actually was listening to it this morning, having coffee while I was setting
nice.
up my little area here too. So
Yeah, so does it work? It seems to work in the morning, you know? I
yeah,
don't know. I hope.
it gives me the kind of vibes of like I've seen you in a couple of different atmospheres over the years,
Yeah.
but it kind of gives me the same kind of vibe as sitting out in a field watching you somewhere with one of your like a more intimate acoustic setting.
Yeah.
It kind of
Yeah.
like I feel like you're somewhere sitting around me
Yeah.
performing.
Yeah. Well, that's what I wanted the record to feel like, that sort of intimacy, for lack of a, like it, yeah, that directness. And also the kind of, there's a bit of a rustle in the room. You can hear like
Hmm.
things sometimes moving about. Like when I'm shimmying on a chair, you can hear this kind of noise. So there's something about like, yeah, it feels like you're present. I wanted it to feel like, yeah, you're kind of right there. And so yeah, that's good to hear. I never made a record quite like it. I mean, I've done other records using the 4 track and Need a Medical Attention. My first solo record, some of that was done on 4 track, and um, but this was the first time I really like hemmed it into just trying to make it mostly acoustic instruments. Bill
Hmm.
Stevenson played piano on one
Cool.
track, and Wurlitzer on another, but that's everything else on the record's just sort of me playing along and adding the overdubs myself. So.
And so when you're getting ready to do a tour off of this, which is coming up,
Mhm.
are you bringing full band? Is it a smaller
No,
scaled
I'm
down
going out
performance?
totally going out solo. I'm
Yeah.
taking a bunch of guitars with me
Hmm.
and a few other sort of tricks or that kind of, I'm putting a little stage show together for it, but I'm going to just do 2 sets playing totally on my own. So I'm kind of making it up as I go along. And so I'm in the process of just gearing up to hit the road, and I'm like figuring it out right now.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, I mean, with the nature of the song, I think the tour will have a songs and stories element to it, which is kind of what my solo shows often are, but I might lean into the stories a little bit too, because, or at least sort of memories, I guess. The album title, One Real Reveal, I think lends itself to, I mean, I find the record is quiet. My solo shows, I try not to make them too slow. Like I still like to, you know, I like to sort of, I like to perform, and I like it to get a little, to swing a little bit, certainly towards the end, even if I'm playing solo. But yeah, so I want the record to kind of strike the tone of the album, but also strike the tone of just, I don't know. I think I'm going to share some memories, maybe even some images, and yeah, it's gonna be fun. Yeah,
And I do know that you are quite the storyteller, not just lyrically, but having seen you perform, it's obvious that you like performing. You keep the whole stage going and a flow in between the songs where you kind of interact with the crowd.
yeah,
So I'm curious too. There's some spoken word elements
yeah.
incorporated into this recording. And now I'm not, I don't want to assume that you've not done that on any of your recordings because
Mm.
there's an extensive back catalog there.
Yeah, yeah,
But it seems very prominent where it is featured on the new album. So is
yeah.
this something that you're like a new kind of direction artistically, or is there something for this album?
I don't know. I don't know. I mean, it might show up again. I mean, there's been little moments of speaking. Like on my last record, I have a song that I recorded with my son, and we have a little dialogue back and forth. It's called Rock, Paper, Scissors, Meteor, where like I ask questions and he answers it. So it gets a little, kind of like, it's kind of humorous, but also, uh, so there's these little moments where I would sort of maybe kind of approach that. But this spoken word poem on this record, The New Joys, is definitely more singular in that. And I just wrote that poem, and I thought, oh, maybe there's some lyrics in it or whatever. And every time I went to sort of think about it in a song format, it just didn't didn't seem as interesting as just reciting it in some fashion. So that was actually performed live at the Carlton with Bill
Oh,
Stevenson on the Wurlitzer. He improvised it in the background. And I said, Bill came up to play one other song with me, and I was recording the show, and I just said, "Hey, Bill, can you just play something? I'm going to read this poem." And he just did that. And we recorded it. And then I took it back to the studio and I laid three more tracks on top of it of me doing a little bit of doubling and adding a bit of guitar, just so it's a kind of hybrid live performance. You can just hear the tail end of the crowd at the very end of the fade out if you listen on the record. Um, and so I just, again, it was live. So I tried not to make even just the reading of it too precious. It was just a very much in the moment thing. I think I even got a couple of the words wrong, but now they're the words because it's recorded.
yeah. That's the beauty
Um,
of being the creator.
that's kind of the beauty of it. Nobody really knows the difference. But yeah, I don't know. I like that. I mean, I I never got Nick Cave until recently. I've been sort of getting into Nick Cave's music. Um, he didn't connect with me when I was younger. I found it maybe too melodramatic or something. But
Mhm.
I've heard some of his recent music, and there's some really remarkable moments. And he's got a great voice, got a great sort of speaking voice. And while he's singing, he also has that kind of talk singing element where there's this sort of, and I wasn't trying to do that exactly, but I've been listening to him a little bit. It might have informed this
Sure.
a little bit. I'm not sure. I think I might have even written the poem before I'd even really been listening to Nick Cave, but just when I went to record it, it's just that sort of, I don't know, made a lot of records, just trying to change it up and keep it interesting. I thought the spoken word bit on the record too, for some reason, there's a few spots on the record that happens. There's sort of, and there's something about, especially when you're playing quiet music, where people can kind of zone out because it doesn't have that high energy that's going to grab you all the time. Then when you break into speaking, it's a bit like it's like even if you were drifting off, it's like suddenly there's a voice of somebody talking to you. So
Yeah.
if you find yourself spacing out, I realized there was something to it in the context of this record to sort of just hit like a little reset, to kind of make you sort of pay attention or
Yeah, it definitely draws you back in.
draws you back in. Yeah. So there was a deliberation there, in terms of realizing that it might sort of help with the pace of the record. It's not a long record, but there's a lot of quiet songs. So
Sure. And now that album is not out as of this recording.
yep,
And
yep.
I have all the press release details here, and I will put some stuff down in the description below. But what's the actual release date for the album?
So it comes out Friday, September 13th. Um,
And the tour's just after that?
the tour starts on the 17th. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. And what's interesting is tour starts in Nanaimo on the West Coast, right? And then it runs in sort of three legs. We go kind of Nanaimo to Winnipeg, and then there's an East Coast run, and then an Ontario leg. And so, but yeah, it starts in Nanaimo, and so much of this record was either like was written and or recorded, um, right around full moons, like on a full moon or
Cool.
just in the wake of a full moon. And it's funny because I just looked up the other day. I looked up. I like to check when the full moons are, and the first full moon's Nanaimo. So we're starting the tour on a full moon, and like I put a little stock in those. Well, more than a little. I think there's something to full moon energy creatively, at least for me, when I pay attention to it, you
Hmm.
know. And so I was just kind of, it was a happy serendipity that the tour's starting on a full moon as well. It seemed fitting for kind of the way the
Oh,
record
it's an
came.
awesome coincidence for sure.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
there's definitely something a little mystical about how all that
Yeah,
starts
yeah,
to
and
come into play.
the older I get, the more I try to tune into those things and not just sort of kind of brush them aside. I think when things kind of come together in those ways, I sort of go, yeah, all right, kind of feel like
Hmm.
I'm rolling with an energy, like I'm in the flow of something that feels like it's, if not uninhibited, it feels like it's got some sort of natural quality I've tuned into some wavelength temporarily. Normally I'm really distracted and busy and not paying a lot of attention to the natural world, which is sort of not something I'm proud of. It's just the way I'm wired, and the way the kind of modern
Oh, the go, go, go.
tech and the go, 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 the modern sort of capitalist sort of thing just drags you into this sort of this trance that sort of takes you outside of what is actually sort of maybe the way the world really works.
And kind of follow along that mindset too, where you obviously, despite having very ambitious projects, you keep your fingers kind of out in a few other projects, so you always have something to go to next. So do
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
have anything in mind for, like, once this tour is done, which is quite extensive,
Mm.
brand new album, recording in a different format? So you mean you're trying to bring in an audience where you're not 100% sure? I mean, I know it's going to do great, but you
Yeah.
haven't seen it do that
Oh,
yet.
oh,
So
I got some nerves around the tour for sure because I'm trying a few different things on this tour. But I'm chipping away on another record too. I've got sort of half of it recorded in some capacity, you know. There was time like over the course of the like when the pandemic hit,
mm,
found I started to experiment more, and I had these sessions once it was okay to get together with a few people. I did these things called the window in sessions here in the studio where people would join me and we'd play each other's songs or do a cover or whatever. Did a really fun one with Garrett Mason. We did this cover of a Kraftwerk tune. Bill Stevenson, who plays on this record, Bill and I did a great session. Here, and those kind of like sessions that were like that had no agenda. It was like, let's get together and
mm,
see what happens. Um, Kind of informed the way I move now, which is there's like a long-term agenda. But if I read this book in 2021, I think, or something like that, by this English mystic uh, named Russell Williams. He's no longer alive. He was kind of survived the Second World War, kind of came out of the war, having lost his parents, had no family, and he basically, as a young man, he'd been traumatized by the war, and he started working with animals and with like a traveling circus in England or something. And he basically came across Buddhist practices without knowing what Buddhism was. It's the way I kind of understood read his story. And then it got pointed out that, hey, you're kind of like a Buddhist, you know. And I think he joined the Manchester. He started to teach in Manchester. He gave these kind of talks. And anyway, this is just a story. There's this one memoir where it's half memoir of his, and then or people writing his bio, and then half interviews with him. And there's one thing he said in it, a bunch of things in it were great, but the one thing I think about it every day, and I say it to a lot of people. I think not barely a day passes when I use the expression now a lot. Um, and he says, have a loose grip on everything. Uh, your family, your friends, everything. Because if you hold anything too tight, you break it. You can break it, and you got to put it down when you need to. But you hold it loose, so you hold everything loosely. And so I think about that with music a lot. I'm like, what if I get sick on the road? What if the shows get canceled? What if and then it's like you just got to stop holding everything so tightly. And
mm,
I'm somebody who's like to have a degree of control over everything for the years, like I like to I put a lot of thought into what I do, and I tend to try to plan things. And I'm still planning stuff, I'm always trying to hatch stuff, but I'm trying to be like loose about even those plans. Like
yeah,
if something doesn't come together, so when I'm like, hey, are you interested in this? And somebody's like, no, I'm like, cool, it wasn't meant to happen, and I just like sort of, I'll sort of like put probes out there and see what sticks. And just see what actually can happen this week today. As a result, I feel quite scattered some days, but there's always something to do if I just
yeah,
sort of like turn my attention elsewhere. So I feel like I can almost seem a little more wishy-washy than I used to because I'm a little less firm in my footing. But there's that, but that loose grip idea seems to be the way I want to make music, and also maybe just operate as a performer, where if something
yeah.
doesn't work or something's not working, I'm like, cool, let's do something else.
Yeah, I think anyone
You know?
that follows my content probably realizes I can relate quite a bit, because despite
Yeah,
this being a podcast, it's not on a regular schedule. It's
you're right.
quite
Cool. Yeah,
consistently, there's content constantly coming, but you can't tune in every Wednesday for a new episode. I should
yeah,
do that. That's the way you're supposed to do it, but
I know. Yeah, I don't
it's
know. I
just not.
think that sort of scheduled time, um, it can serve a purpose, but I sort of think it might be one of the facets of modern sort of life, scheduled
Yeah.
capitalist sort of extractive thinking to make everything as efficient as you can all the time, right? Everything's about efficiency in a
Hmm.
sort of way in terms of we can make more money if we're more efficient. It's like,
Yeah.
how about we make less money and we're less efficient, but
Yeah.
we don't but we don't have to be wasteful of it. That doesn't mean being wasteful. It means like being deliberate and not being like extractive in the
Yes.
way we're gonna try to operate with other people, with systems and stuff. And I mean, obviously we all gotta like but it's gonna make a living, and kind of we're all participating in this like pretty complex world where there's no way you can really extract yourself from the nature of it. But I do feel like by by letting things breathe a little bit and not trying to control them as much, if we were to actually dial back our desire for control collectively as a society, I actually think we'd see a lot. I
Hmm.
think things would run wild. I think it might look like they're running wild for a while, and that's why people rush to try to control it. But I actually think we might end up with a better version of events,
Absolutely.
if we were to let things kind of operate in a more convivial
Yeah,
fashion,
everything will eventually find its own pacing.
Yeah, pacing, that's what it is. And sort of like letting it, yeah, finding a natural pacing for things as opposed to
Yeah.
like a set programmed one. I still want to know that the garbage man's going to show up every Thursday
Yeah,
to
yeah,
the,
yeah.
you know. So there's something to be said for things operating in a certain way, but maybe if we had a different pacing, there wouldn't be as much garbage, for them to
True.
pick, right?
True, exactly.
So yeah.
And so now anyone that wants to follow, like we're not quite at the album and the tour's coming up, anyone that wants to follow what's happening and above and beyond this album release and the
Yeah.
tour, social media is king these days, but I
Yeah.
know I follow your accounts and I follow you roughly over the last 3 decades too. So where do you prefer to interact with fans or communicate to people what you have coming out?
Yeah, I've got things go up on Instagram
Hmm.
and Twitter and my Facebook, all three of which I don't actively have on my phone. And when something's posted there, I actually send it to my management and say, "Can you post this for me?"
Yeah,
Um, and as a result, I'm not super present there. I don't. I'll go in and I'll read stuff now and then, and I'll and I'm not. I don't turn an entire blind eye to it, but I find that those platforms in particular, and the way the algorithm works, is a shrouded in mystery. You've got to game it, which I think is
yeah.
fundamentally wrong. Like, obviously, I've got people who'll try to game it on my behalf. Like
Hmm.
within my management's not going to turn a blind eye to how these things work, but I don't want to preoccupy myself with like, oh, it's better to post Wednesday at 7 at
Yeah,
night.
yeah.
And if you post twice in one day, you're going to get less activity. I'm like, okay, so if that's the nature of it, sure, fine. But I'm not going to sit there and try to figure that out, and look, I don't begrudge anybody doing that because I feel for young artists because the nature of the thing right now is all self-promotion within these really narrow bandwidths that are owned by a handful of people.
Hmm.
I think that's hugely problematic and really, really kind of, I think too, it doesn't welcome every form of art. I think people who are introspective in the way they make art have a really hard time. I think a lot of artists are by nature introspective, but I think even say like more unusual forms of music, like pop stars get up and dance, or they kind of go, I'm a performer, right? But other people are like writers and they still want to get their music out there, but they have to go into kind of into a performative space. Social
Yes.
media is like a performative space, right? And so that can really mean that you don't see a lot of people like that there, and you get a narrower bandwidth of what's actually happening. Um, I use my mailing list is on Substack now, and I have
Okay.
a subscriber platform on Substack. So I have a handful of people who sort of pay to subscribe, and then a bunch of people who just sign the mailing list and get the free posts. And then I do some paid subscriber posts where I have more content. You know what? I hate the word content, so strike that.
Sure.
You can leave that in the interview, but I'm striking it from my vocabulary. I really don't like it. You see it when you open up YouTube, it says content. It's
Oh
like,
yeah.
this is content. This is my songs. Um, but I put up so like performances and things like that. And so I interact a little more on Substack. Not that a lot of people are there yet. Do you know what I mean? Like
Hmm.
obviously there's much more activity in the Instagram universe. It's hard to compete with these massive platforms. But I'm trying to see if I can bring my audience over into sort of my mailing list
Yeah.
capacity and the Substack. is a little less algorithmic in the way. I mean, I know there's algorithms involved, but it feels like more direct and less shrouded by
Sure.
just, people are going to go there to seek out what you're doing. Whereas I feel like you can do a post on Instagram and don't know if it's land. Why did this one reach this many people and
Right.
that one didn't? And nobody ever explains it to you.
Yeah.
You're like, so what, you're just in a sea of the feed. And so if you're competing with a bunch of other things, plus if you do anything in those platforms, this is getting technical, but from my understanding is like, if you mention the word Substack in your Instagram, they bury it,
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
know, right? Like they don't want you to leave the platform, right? So
Yeah.
you can't even like try to throw to something elsewhere that's important to you. So like that kind of manipulation, I think, is really destructive for
Oh
creativity.
yeah. Things get buried for sure.
Things get buried. So, I mean, this is more, actually, this is more time that I want to give to those platforms in this interview, but it is part of the world that we're living in. And I do feel for people because we're all just sort of like trying to kind of struggling to cut through all that noise.
Mhm.
Um, and it can be really, really challenging. And I think it can be demoralizing. I think it's really hard on people's mental health. I know it's been challenging on mine, and that's why I've sort of taken it. It's
For sure.
so addictive. It's so
Yeah. Oh yeah. No, I'm on vacation and I'm trying to find a way to kind of back away from it
back away
because
from it. Yeah. And
yeah.
I mean, I tune into it. I'm not going to pretend that I'm like completely, I come and go, I
Yeah.
sort of, okay, done. And I'll really keep it at arm's length for like a month. And then then you go down the rabbit hole and start reading stuff,
Yeah, exactly.
pulls you along. So, yeah.
And for the last bit of our interview here today, I know you're getting ready to put the album out and go on tour, and you have a lot of these interviews coming up as well. Is there any selection from the album that you'd like to play off with to kind of give people a preview?
Yeah. Let me think here. I mean, I, uh, I'm fond of, they're all different. I would be curious to know what you hear. I quite like, there's a really short song on it that I wrote for an encore.
Yeah.
I was doing two sets in Iona in Iona, Cape Breton at the Folk and Frolic pub, and I had a motel room there. And between the sets, I went back to just chill at the motel room. And I was like, what am I going to play if I get an encore tonight? I was like, and I literally had the guitar, and I just thought maybe I should write a song really quick. So I wrote this song, like a goodbye song to Iona.
Yes.
So I call it Iona, and so it was written kind of as a love song to Iona, to somebody, and I wrote it really fast, and I thought, oh, that's kind of a nice one, and I like the way that recording turned out. So yeah, you could play Iona.
Perfect.
Some loves will never make sense. Two twos aren't four. When you look my way, I can't just sit on the fence and watch the Brador day after day. 3 years ago when we met, leaving your lips, I heard my words before the total eclipse. Ooh, we were free, free as the birds. Iona, if you're at my door, you hold the key. Iona, I'm on your floor, I'm down on my knees. Iona, you owe me nothing, we're even. Iona, my only, I'm leaving.